that screen. Well,
Hey, everybody. We'll keep building our quorum. Kimberly, are you okay with going first or second, depending what Bethany prefers?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I was anticipating you'd go first, but I just wanted to make sure that she's fine with that too.
Yeah, no problem.
Danielle, looks like you're someplace cool. That doesn't seem to be a virtual background.
Yeah, I'm at Lost Coffee today.
Nice.
Straight from my home office.
Well, good. Welcome, everyone. We'll give another minute for quorum building. I'm hosting today since Russ is on vacation, so I will be bringing us along. Bethany, while we're quorum building, do you have a preference for going first or second? Kim said she's fine either way. Bethany may have stepped away for just a sec.
Hi, Amy. Were you asking me a question?
Yes. If you cared, if Kim goes first and you go second, or if you had a preference.
I am happy with either order. I am ready, very excited to teach you all about stakeholder engagement whenever you want me.
We're very excited to hear about it. But while you're talking too, in the spirit of announcements, Russ told me that one of our announcements should include letting you announce your recent funding. Would you like to tell us about that as we're quorum building?
Yes, it actually goes very well with my presentation. So do you want the long version or the short version?
You give us the 1 minute version.
The 1 minute version. Okay. So in 2016, so almost exactly 5 years ago, my mother passed away from glioblastoma. And 2 weeks later, I had the brilliant idea of going to a conference. And I'm glad I did. The universe apparently made me go. And I met a woman who is herself living with a grade 2 astrocytoma. And we had a conversation about how brain cancer kind of sucks and we should do something about it. And so we started writing grants, and Liz, my brain tumor patient partner, is like a rainmaker, and like every grant we've ever written has gotten funded. And most recently, just last week, we got a notice of award for a National Cancer Institute Center grant, where Liz and I will be co-leading the engagement optimization unit in partnership with Yale's low-grade glioma registry. And it's a project for which we will be doing comparative effectiveness of stakeholder engagement methods and figuring out the best way to engage people with brain tumors and their care partners and their clinicians in genomic research in brain tumors. So
that's awesome, Bethany. You're seeing lots of applause emojis going up. I think we can also just applaud with our hands. It's great. Way to go. Congratulations. So proud of you. And I was just thinking to myself as you gave that intro, how we all grieve in different ways, right? And as a researcher, sometimes we grieve by going to conferences, right? So there you go.
yes, my coping mechanism has been going to conferences and writing papers and grants. And my mother's 70th birthday would have been just a day after we received the notice of award. And I was like,
oh, wow.
That was her gift to us.
That's so amazing. What a great story, Bethany. Well, thank you so much for that. That's just such a great note to start our meeting on today. For those of you who didn't hear, Russ is on vacation today. He does get to take vacation now and then. So since I'm leading the class, the portion of this meeting that's the class, I'm just taking over leading the meeting today. And he asked me to give a couple other announcements besides having Bethany note that. One is, as you've already heard him mention previously, I hope, that Dr. Perez-Hollis, who we're recruiting to come join our D&I team here, is giving a talk this Thursday at noon. Victoria, if you can throw that in the chat possibly as we're going, otherwise I'll grab it in a little bit and put the link. If you haven't already signed up, you can click on that, register, or get the information for that. So Thursday at noon. Dr. Perez-Hollis, as some of you might know, had helped write some of the form and function papers. So we talk about that a lot in this group, has a lot of interesting work. And I'm looking forward to her talk. As long as I can get done with my clinic morning in time to listen to it, we'll see how well I can squeeze that all in. So the other piece is that next week we will be in this session, having an informal, open-ended discussion with Dr. Perez-Holez. So we will also send around one of her articles in her CV that'll be part of that discussion. And then we do also have a journal club for next Tuesday. So we do have a full agenda for next Tuesday, looking for things for future weeks though. So please do go ahead and send Victoria and Russ if you've got something you'd like to do as a work in progress or something else for a future session. So I think without further ado, then I'll turn things over to Kimberly Mondin to do our journal club article for today and discussion. And we'll have up to 3:15 or so to be able to do the discussion after she presents. And then we'll make sure to break by then, if not earlier, for Bethany's talk. So take it away, Kim.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking today about interdisciplinary team science and also engaging the public. So it dovetails nicely with what Bethany is going to talk about today, and particularly steps towards a participatory team science. So this is the Tebbis and Tai article. So I chose this article to discuss today because stakeholder engagement in participatory research is something that I'm very passionate about. I've learned a lot of things the hard way. So hopefully can impart a little bit of wisdom as I talk today, even though I am a student. And then I think it's also a very important aspect of dissemination and implementation research, but I don't think many of us have a lot of experience engaging multiple stakeholders and engaging in participatory science, so like across multiple disciplines, and how to do that really meaningfully to truly integrate other people's perspectives, knowledge, and experiences into our research process. So to start out in this article, they give a brief description of the different types of research on a continuum. So from multidisciplinary research on the left to transdisciplinary research on the right. Multidisciplinary research is probably what we're all most comfortable with. I think that's kind of what we're taught and what tends to get funded. So these are collaborations by investigators from 2 or more disciplines who focus on a common problem. And they each tackle that problem from the perspective of their own discipline. This often I've seen in grants that I've been on, you might have multiple co-PIs on a study, but people aren't really kind of combining their ideas. Everyone's just coming at it from their silo. The next step would be interdisciplinary research. And this is collaboration among investigators from different disciplines who develop a shared mental model to guide the research. So here you're mixing ideas. You're not just coming at it from your silo and approaching from your lens, you're learning from other people and how to approach this from a common perspective. And so in this model, collaborators will blend models and methods from their respective disciplines. And then finally on the right, you have transdisciplinary research, which is interdisciplinary research that eventually results in a new hybrid discipline. So they gave examples like women's studies and bioengineering. So what exactly is interdisciplinary team science? It involves research collaboration among investigators from different disciplines who work independently to share leadership and responsibility. And then I think it's important to really think about, why should I do this? It sounds like it takes a lot of effort and a little more energy, and maybe I have to step outside of my comfort zone. So what are some of the benefits to engaging in interdisciplinary team science? So this type of collaboration allows us to address complex problems that maybe we wouldn't be able to address perhaps individually in a single discipline. And then interdisciplinary team science can also help accelerate knowledge translation from the laboratory to the clinic, or hopefully to the community. In the article, they talk about different ways of engaging in interdisciplinary team science. As I mentioned, it requires a different framework for science practice. And so instead of organizing your research team as a hierarchy, as we would normally think of in terms of a lab, the PI will collaborate with one or more investigators from another discipline as a co-PI. And again, you're all working on a common project, but there's usually multiple leaders in an interdisciplinary team science, as opposed to just one PI as the head of the lab, truly driving all aspects of the project. And the authors use the term HETERARCHY. And so they say interdisciplinary science is organized as a heterarchy. And they define a heterarchy as a complex adaptive system of interconnected, overlapping, and dynamic components that govern interdependent and network components. It's a lot of words. So really what this boils down to is that a heterarchy is non-hierarchical. There's typically shared leadership. As I mentioned, typically you'll have a PI and multiple co-PIs. There's mutual accountability for the project. There's a lot of interdependence, and then also power sharing. And team members are really encouraged to contribute as leaders and collaborators. So really, when I think about this in practice, in some of the teams I've been involved that are like this, people really aren't just kind of pigeonholed, is the best way to say it. They're given the flexibility to contribute in many different ways. In some aspects, being asked to step up as leaders, and others, maybe taking a different role. So maybe people's roles throughout the whole research project aren't just static. They might change during different times of the research process. The authors also talk a lot about obviously teamwork, knowledge integration, and the social interactions that are involved in team science or on a science team. And they say that a team's integrative capacity is the foundation for knowledge integration, which requires managing the social interactions of the team to do several things. So first, to develop a shared mental model of the problem and how to address it scientifically, to identify team roles and tasks, and to establish communication structures and processes to carry out the work. And I think this is really important. You have to, I think, when you're engaging in team science, participatory science, however, engaging multiple stakeholders, any of the different terms we want to use, I think we do need to put a lot of emphasis on the social interactions among the team to build trust among all of those who are engaged in the team. Anytime I think you're working with more people, that becomes even more important to make sure there's a lot of trust among the team members. I'm just thinking of one of my own personal experiences pertaining to this first item: develop a shared mental model of the problem and how to address it scientifically. So I think I mentioned on a previous call, we were awarded a Spinal Cord Injury Model Systems Center Award, like a center grant through NIH, but it's through a different agency, NIDLR. And we have a stakeholder engagement committee that's comprised of individuals with lived experience, some other stakeholders as well, not just individuals with lived experience. But when we were talking about one of our site-specific projects and how we as scientists were thinking about it, and we engaged the community, we realized the way we were thinking about tackling the problem was completely wrong. And we really had to shift our thinking to match that of the community. So to be a little more concrete, we were looking at, in the SCI research world, there's been a lot of attention paid to telehealth interventions for exercise, because there's so many transportation barriers to get to the gym for people with spinal cord injury and other physical disabilities. And so we were looking at building a telehealth intervention, and we heard a resounding no. We want to work out in the gym like everybody else. Like, we don't want to work out in isolation. The social piece is a big part of that. And we had to kind of just completely go back to the drawing board. But through listening to the community and going back to the drawing board, I think that was a huge step in building trust among our community. The author, I had never heard this distinction before until I read this article, and the authors talk about mode 1 versus mode 2 science. So the use of hierarchical structures is a shift in thinking in science. And as I mentioned, the authors make this distinction between mode 1 and mode 2 science. So knowledge production in science has typically followed norms associated with mode 1, so that it's unidisciplinary, that's a hard word, university and institution-based, hierarchically organized, prioritizes investigator autonomy, and seeks universal knowledge. So again, I think that's the way a lot of us are trained, probably fairly comfortable to most of us. whereas a heterarchical model is consistent with mode 2, which is more inter or transdisciplinary, emphasizes multiple and mixed methods, is co-produced with multiple stakeholders, it's very collaborative in nature, transparent, and seeks knowledge embedded in local contexts and cultures. Then the authors go on to talk about specifically public engagement in science. And so along with the growth of mode 2 science, the call for public engagement in science has also increased. And so the central argument for public engagement is that stakeholders are experts in local and contextualized knowledge relevant to the research question. And I think in D&I, we're all well aware of that and should be including stakeholders in the research process, but even specifically public stakeholders. In my area of research, they prefer not to be called public stakeholders. They prefer to be called individuals with lived experience. And so if I use that term, that's where it comes from. And public engagement can inform the research practice gap, explain data abnormalities, and guide how research is implemented, communicated, or disseminated. So we actually had a long discussion, as I mentioned, that term that our community prefers to use, individuals with lived experience. A lot of people had consumer advisory boards, didn't like the term consumer. And so it was really among the community that it was decided they preferred individuals with lived experience. So speaking specifically about participatory team science, this blends interdisciplinary team science with participatory research approaches. It involves research that's done with rather than for individuals who are participants rather than subjects. And I do think that the language we use is really important when we're talking about these things. And then public engagement during all phases of team. So the authors argue that public engagement during all phases of team science is unrealistic, cost prohibitive, and unsustainable. So therefore, stakeholders may not occupy key roles in every phase of the research process, but they may join the team for some duration of the research or during specific phases. So they may come in and out of the research process depending on the nature of the collaboration. And they provide this example of participatory team science and these different phases. So as the team progresses through these 4 phases, the interactions among members are part of a recursive process that affects the team's integrative capacity. And building that capacity requires managing social interactions within the team to foster trust, psychological safety, and other qualities essential to get the task done in each phase. And then what may be unique about participatory team science is that social interactions are now managed within an interdisciplinary team of investigators who each operate interdependently, to lead parts of the research process. So if you look at what I think this figure is really trying to portray is that you see different people moving in and out or moving higher in the bubble or lower in the bubble for each of these phases of the research process. So in the development phase, you're focusing on defining the problem, developing a shared mental model to study it, and establishing a team identity. So really thinking about what stakeholders you would want involved in that phase of the process. And then the conceptualization phase, which involves identifying the research question and the design, establishing communication practices within the team, and specifying team roles and responsibilities. The implementation phase, so carrying out the research, coordinating the work, and making adjustments as needed, managing conflict, and integrating what is learned from the stakeholders and in the research process. And then finally, the translation phase, applying learnings to address challenges with real-world impact, developing relevant partnerships for dissemination and translation. So there are some challenges to participatory team science that the authors address in the article. There's many institutional policies that work against interdisciplinary and team science, and I saw some posts about that in our discussion board as well, that some people experience some hurdles. I think it's fair to say that disciplinary research still receives the majority of funding. So I think there's different mechanisms that are more friendly to this type of research. But on the whole, I think mode 1 science still probably gets the majority of funding. And there are no generally accepted norms for providing compensation to public stakeholders engaged in research as consultants, community or content experts, or advisors. And this can create an equity issue. So I think as much as we want to build a heterarchy, there are going to be power differentials when you're engaging different stakeholders, especially public or individuals with lived experience. And compensation is one way to deal with that power differential, but in my work, I have seen that come up in multiple different ways that we've just had to really address head on and continuously throughout the process. And then there's a lack of education and training in team science for investigators and the public. In my field, actually, there's one of our consumer or community advocacy groups, the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, is actually building modules for researchers and also for individuals with lived experience and other people with a stake in spinal cord injury research to become involved in the research process. And so I do think there is a lot more awareness that we need more training on all sides on how to proactively engage together in the research process. So stepping away from that particular article and turning again to my discipline. So I'm a spinal cord injury researcher. It's a very small field, but we, I think, have done a very good job traditionally of integrating particularly stakeholders with lived experience. We're starting to get better about including other stakeholders, including people at like the policy level, insurance, people in the public health domain. But there's this really nice model, the Integrated Knowledge Translation Guiding Principles for Conducting and Dissemination Spinal Cord Injury Research in Partnership. And I put this article up here as a reference. I know it's specific to spinal cord injury, but I think you could take the principles and obviously apply them across disciplines. And the key takeaway is, integrated knowledge translation is the meaningful engagement of the right research users at the right time throughout the spinal cord injury research process. And I think that speaks really to what they were saying in this article as well. In participatory team science, not all players are going to be necessarily involved at every part of the process, but you want to know who needs to be at the table at what time in the research process. And these are the integrated knowledge translation guiding principles, again, in the SCI world. This is the link to their website. It's through the University of British Columbia. And they say to engage more meaningfully in research that's relevant, useful, or usable, we need to engage partners and develop and maintain relationships based on trust, respect, dignity, and transparency. We need to work with partners to share in our decision-making. We have to foster open, honest, and responsive communication, recognize value, and share diverse expertise, experience, and knowledge of all of our stakeholders. Be flexible and receptive in tailoring the research approach to match the aims and the context of the project. They say if you follow these guidelines, partners can meaningfully benefit by participating in the partnership. So everybody's gaining something from the partnership. We should address ethical considerations and then respect the practical considerations and financial constraints of all partners. What I really like about this group is they talk a lot about avoiding tokenism, especially when you're engaging patients or individuals with lived experience. I know oftentimes the communities that we've dealt with have felt we haven't engaged properly and really felt like we were using them in a manner that was consistent with tokenism. And that's never nice to hear. And that's an example of something gone wrong. So I can say at a previous institution I worked at, our stakeholders were brought in twice a year. We fed them some snacks, we presented our findings, and then they went home. And that was their idea of stakeholder engagement. And as we know, that's not a meaningful way to engage people. So I can see why they may have taken away a feeling that they were being used as tokens in that scenario. So the key takeaways, I think, from this article is that participatory team science is complex, which lends well to last week's discussion. It needs to be conducted with care, and I really think with authentic intention. Stakeholders should be engaged early and often throughout the research process. There are some limitations, such as funding stakeholders, but I believe there's creative ways around those hurdles, which I hope we can discuss in a few minutes. And then developing a hierarchical research team will require more time investing in relationships to build trust among team members. But from personal experience, I do believe that it's very rewarding and that work pays off. So these are some of the questions I wanted to pose to the group. But I think, first of all, just kind of getting an overall sense of the article and what people thought.
Absolutely, Kim. Wonderful talk. It might be, do you want to unshare slides for just a moment now that people have had a chance to kind of see them a little bit, and we might end up having you kind of re-put some things into the chat as we go, or kind of pull them back up again to feed people's thoughts again. But there's a lot of things in the chat as well, which is sometimes a nice place to start if there's not an initial response. But you asked, what are people's thoughts in general, if people had any comments? So does anyone have an overarching comment?
Hi, this is Felipe. What's really interesting here to me is that we don't want to go into extreme hierarchies, because that really defeats the purpose of collaboration. On the other hand, if everyone is equal, that's a good thing, except that one of the challenges, I think, is that there has to be some leadership in terms of keeping the project on trajectory. And so the best metaphor I can think of is a conductor who obviously wants to make sure all the pieces are working in tandem, because I think if not, someone that oversees it, although they may not necessarily be the final decision maker, but there's got to be some way of keeping a process going so that the project moves forward rather than in circles.
I love that analogy. I think you could write a whole paper on that.
Well, thank you. But a very nice presentation, by the way.
Thank you. I agree. I mean, I do think no organization can be completely flat, right? Or you will just go in circles or maybe go sideways. So I do think there need to be some people ultimately accountable. And those are usually the people who, if you're talking research funding, who are probably awarded the grant, right? So I guess heterarchy maybe is somewhat aspirational.
I was looking in Canvas, and Heidi, I don't know if you would be interested in posing the question you had put in Canvas, or if you just put it there and don't remember, I could also remind you, but it resonates with some of the things in the chat as well.
I think honestly, I'm not 100% sure. So Amy, feel free to correct me if this is not my question, but my question was just about I know that stakeholders are engaged differently during various phases of the research, but it's like when there's no compensation for them, how do you get around this, and how do you engage them for long periods of time? We're implementing, by we, I mean, Kathy's on this call too, but I don't know if she's listening right now, but we have this 5-year grant, where we have stakeholders that we're trying to engage throughout the entire thing. And so I don't know, I'm just curious about different approaches that other people have.
We always budget for it. And actually in a lot of the NIDLR grants, it's a scored criteria and it needs to be in your budget. So I think that's very wise. DOD also in their spinal cord injury research program, they require you to have people with lived experience on your grant. So again, we're going to want to have a budget line. So we usually pay people, I think I saw Bethany say, anywhere between $50 to $100 an hour. Where we run into problems is a lot of our people that puts them over the limits for disability. And so we sometimes have to be, then they'll say I'd love to participate. I don't really want to give my expertise away for free, but if you pay me, I'm going to lose my benefits. So we have to be a little creative sometimes, or sometimes people will say, give that payment as a donation to a cause. But I really think when you're designing your research project and in the grant development phase, you have to think about how you're going to engage them, just like you would include a framework. I think it needs to be laid out in the grant, and then that should follow in the budget and how you're going to compensate them. We have also, I mean, I know every institution can't do this, but our department chair is pretty dedicated to this as well. And we actually hired a person in the department who's hard funded, so that he is our tie to the community. He is kind of an overall advisor on a lot of our research projects to just put our science brains in check and be like, hey guys, like, here's what it's actually like to live with tetraplegia. Like, hold on a minute, we're not even there yet. So he's our reality check, but he's also helps disseminate our findings. So I guess, Heidi, there's no easy answer. Build it in your budget.
I think like an issue that we're running into is like, that would be awesome if we could build it into our budget, but we can't. There's no funds to even like hire people to like implement one of the practices, like one of the initiatives that we're doing. And so like all the frontline providers are kind of rightfully grumpy because they feel like it adds to their workload. And so there's a lot of pushback about doing this because they're like, well, there's no benefit for me in this. Like, you're just adding to my workload. Right. And I totally get that. And so it's just like, figuring out how to deal with that is complicated. It's fine. You don't need to know the answer. But if anybody here has recommendations, that would be great.
So it's like, is it a VA rule, Heidi? Is this the issue?
Oh, no, this grant is
like,
no, this whole grant was just, they didn't give us enough money to fund all of to hire people, hire people for an FTE. Like, we have zero money for any FTE at any of the sites that we're expanding to, because we had to obviously pay like our research people.
So Heidi, one of the things I'll talk about in my talk is that there are options if you have very minimal resources for how you can do community and stakeholder engagement. Even in that circumstance, you probably can't convene an advisory panel and have a paired partner with you that you pay, but there are ways to do it that's much cheaper.
For one study I have right now, like, we're doing individual interviews with clinicians and researchers, also individuals with lived experience. And so, we didn't have the money for to Bethany's point, like a whole committee, but we made sure we built in like small interviews along the way, and we are paying them for that. But it's definitely a lot cheaper than like holding meetings every other month with 8 to 10 people.
I love that we've brought that up, and it will be great to kind of pay attention to that when Bethany gives her talk. And I love how the DICE methods does include, sort of certain things for your level of support you can offer. Kim, this might be a good time to pull your questions back up again, and we can see if anyone else has an open-ended comment, but maybe you want to pick one of those questions in particular.
I guess I'm curious how other people have managed real or perceived power differentials when they're engaging in this type of research. I know it's something that we've run into. So I'm just curious to hear other people's experiences, if that's come up for them. I can't see everyone's face, so I don't know if someone's about to talk, but.
This is Jason. I can give you some. So I think still it gets to the section where it talks about the limitations of how academic systems are set up. I mean, ultimately, the grant needs to go through a department for us. And so it tends to be, somebody is ultimately responsible for delivering. And so sometimes it can be problematic if you're not on the same page. And so I always try and set expectations early and sort of suss that stuff out. But I mean, it's, I don't know what other people's experiences, but it's hit or miss. And I tend to this is a terrible thing to say, but once you've dropped the ball, you're sort of dead to me. I'm not going back. So you could be, you could be doing great stuff, but if you couldn't follow through on other stuff, then I'm just not going to work with you again. And so, and I've been on the other side of it where I'm on somebody else's grant, and I guess I have a personal feeling that I don't want to disappoint people, but I'm not. I mean, people have different bosses and different responsibilities. So, but I think ultimately it falls down to whoever's in charge of the grant to pull the weight.
One experience that we had with our stakeholder engagement committee when we were in the process of developing the grant and coming up with our research project, and this is an instance where like power differentials came up, we came up with a list of potential projects that we were going to propose, and then we sent it out to a vote. Well, the community voted in one way and the researchers voted in a very different way. And so which way do you go? And we said, we got to go the research way. You got to trust us on the science. We're not ready for this. We know this is where you want to go. Well, we're not there yet. We don't have the team for that. This isn't our background. So we had to go with what the scientists voted for. And that really upset our community. And they felt like, we weren't listening to them. And that was kind of a place where we, I guess we did pull the power card.
Sounds like that was maybe a tough place where you just weren't able to get to a shared mental model. I really liked that notion that you advanced in your slide about, one of the key pieces of this is we're developing a shared mental model. And I can see how that was, I guess you would hope that you didn't have to get it down to a vote, right?
That's true.
It's hard to share between a vote.
Right. I mean, I think it led to a really good discussion and led to us understanding more from their perspective and them understanding more from where we were coming from a grantsmanship and science perspective, and to show, like aspirationally, we would all love to end up here, but these are the steps we need to do to get there. We're not there yet. We need this money first.
I had an experience like that with the community, trying to do community engagement or stakeholder engagement and leading to a product. But the community per se, or the stakeholders per se, have that power struggle among themselves, because we have traditionally accepted power structures in the community, like school systems, police, the judge system, and they have, by virtue, I don't know how to overcome it. And then the community members felt so, in a way, they felt run over and they don't participate. So I don't know. There is a power dynamic right there with the community alone, without having the intervention of the academia. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, that also adds to the mix, but it is difficult to overcome it. And I don't know, maybe after learning from Bethany's talk, I'll understand a little bit better how to overcome that. But yes, about the shared mental model, I don't think that we are there.
Right. Yeah, for us, it led to, really developing a mission statement and what our values were as a team to start to build that shared mental model. But Jason, I do think, those power differentials can come up among the team too, right? So I think that's still a very relevant point.
Yeah, I think that we are so far, at least from my experience, of even just within like the academic hospital structures, like just even doing interdisciplinary work with other colleagues in other departments is so hard. We don't have we have co-Is in our like IRB, but they will not allow us to just have co-Is. You have to ultimately have a PI that is the one that is responsible. So it's hard, I think, even to do that among different, scientists or researchers from different departments. So
I agree. I mean, somebody, when it comes to IRB, human subjects protection, somebody ultimately has to take responsibility, right? I think.
Lots of good stuff going in the chat. I don't know if you want to try unsharing again, Kim, and if there's anything in there that you wanted to comment on. We've got a couple more minutes before we transition. If there's one more piece, Kim, that you think might be good for us to touch on.
Let's end on a positive. What are some of the good experiences you guys have had? Like, what are some things you've taken away from either an interdisciplinary study or engaging the public?
I mean, what I said earlier is true, that this form of research is incredibly fun and exciting. Not always easy, but I would never go back to sitting alone in my office and coming up with a research project and doing it. I don't even know how to do that anymore. There's no comparison.
And building those relationships, it's so fun. And I'm an introvert and I still think it's fun.
Yeah. My patient partner is texting me over here that she's my biggest fan.
I actually had participants get a site on board. So it started with stakeholders. I was doing some interviews with some preliminary work, and they were talking about, I was trying to figure out good locations for the project, for the vending machine distribution that we were doing for naloxone. And I was asking participants, I was asking people with lived experience where they would want it. And they were in treatment services at Denver Health. And they actually said, you know, it'd be easier if we could actually get it here at Denver Health and some of the EDs in some of these locations. And when I presented that to the Denver Health group, they were really excited about it and said, yeah, why can't we do it here? Or this should be one of the sites. And so I was able to identify one of the sites that wanted to participate based on it coming from the stakeholders wanting that to be one of the locations. So that was kind of a fun way that
That's
stakeholders
great.
contributed.
Awesome.
We had a similar thing where we were interviewing a public health, like a local public health director, to get sort of an administrator perspective on something. And he found out about this other project we were doing with these other, 5 other public health sites involved, and said, oh, we want to be a site. And I was like, oh, we would love to have you, but we've already expended our entire budget for sites. And he's like, well, we don't need any money. We just want to work with you and do this. And I was like, oh, that's a whole new offer.
When does that ever happen?
Yeah, it is pretty amazing, because I think if you have something that is meaningful to people and that they,
Right.
They value either as patients or community members or administrators or providers, that's the best way to get people who are interested in working with you and who are interested in the same topics and willing to contribute a lot to make things a success, knowing that they're going to ultimately hopefully be helping other sites and other systems with the same types of services.
This is Roger, and my comment is all people and organizations are not created equal. And the place where it's most fun are working with people and places that know how to do it, and that are not starting from scratch. What's important, but for me hasn't been fun because of the challenges, is places on the ground, untouched by research or high-level organizational capacities, who really are in need of the interventions the most, but don't know how to do it. And that's a big challenge. Recruiting patients, as you said, who have no resources, or a project having no resources to adequately pay them, or you can't. Administrators who can't even think about how to extract data because of no capacity. Clinicians who are, functioning at 130% of what they should be doing. You know, the things that Russ calls dirty places. It's challenging, it's important, but that doesn't feel like fun to me. And yet, really, I have no interest in working in those places where it's fun. You know, I only want to work in the places where it's dirty, where the need is that significant, if any of that makes any sense.
That's great, Roger. And we're going to use that as our transition point, considering in my mind that Kimberly had us end on many great successes. And then Roger brought us back to the real world to remind us there are places that are hard and dirty and that need the capacity building. And that's a big part of what we're doing here in D&I. So Bethany, let's have you walk us through your presentation and see if we can find parallels to Roger's challenges to work in the hard and dirty sections as you go.
Absolutely. So you definitely do need a place to start. Okay, so most of you have heard a little bit of this before, so I'm hoping it's not redundant because most of you have taken our class in designing for dissemination. So I just wanted to start with a little bit of an overview here. And so I really think of stakeholder engagement as being foundational to designing for dissemination and sustainability, which is this idea that the products of our research need to fit the context that they're intended to be used in. And sometimes the context has low capacity. Sometimes the context is we need to start with initial building blocks before we can really get into the fun part. But even that part, that initial building block can be fun. And so in our Designing for Dissemination Sustainability course, we talk about this organizing schema where we have a conceptualization phase of research where we're determining both need and demand and an evidence base for whatever it is that you're trying to address in the world. And then we really focus on this design phase. And we talk about designing both a dissemination product, an intervention, a technology, just a bit of evidence perhaps, a new methodology, as well as a way that we message, package, and distribute that product. How do we get the word out? How do we share the value propositions to the intended audience? And to create these two products, this dissemination product and your messaging, packaging, and distribution, we have a number of design processes. And for those who took the course most recently this summer, what are some of the design processes that we talk about? Who remembers?
Come on, everybody, pop quiz.
I know, right? You should know, this is what I do. Who remembers some design processes?
Bethany, do you have any hints for us?
Oh no, do we all fail?
Yes, you do. I'm very disappointed. Claudia, what'd you say? You're right.
Oh, yeah. But I didn't take the class now, so I thought maybe it changed. I didn't want to say anything. It was 2 years ago or 3?
Yours was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So Claudia said
it was based on the customer discovery or kind of understanding the needs and match and the pains and the gains and then matching it with the value proposition.
Yes, exactly. And then the goal here is with our design that we're promoting design outcomes like feasibility, acceptability, usability, those sorts of things. And then we go into a dissemination phase where we're distributing our product to intended audiences, putting them in places where our stakeholders think that they will be used, as Nikki just said, and then ultimately watching to see if we're making an impact on key outcomes like adoption, sustainment, and ultimately the most important thing, health and equity benefits. And we note that there's this process of iterative evaluation and returning back to multiple phases of this designing for dissemination process throughout the entire research process. So the design processes that we talk about are methods, frameworks, or approaches used to develop and test our dissemination product. as well as our product messages, packaging, and distribution plans. And so number one is participatory co-design and stakeholder involvement. Other design processes that we incorporate are application of D&I theories and frameworks. A lot of process frameworks in particular incorporate elements of stakeholder engagement in the design, for instance. We use marketing and business approaches like our customer discovery approach that we teach in our D4D course. If you're going to design to fit context, you better have done some sort of analysis of what that context entails. There are systems engineering and complexity science approaches, as well as communication and the arts elements as well, especially for that packaging component of of the distribution process. So I really wanted to show you that participatory co-design and stakeholder involvement is really foundational to what we're doing in designing for dissemination and sustainability. Everything that we do needs to start and end with our stakeholder input. So what exactly is stakeholder engagement? Every word here is important. It is a bidirectional, longitudinal relationship between stakeholders and researchers that informs decision-making about research prioritization, conduct, and dissemination. So importantly here, bidirectional means that this is a conversation, that it is not one way. It's not just me gathering information from the stakeholders and saying, okay, I hear you, I'm gonna go do that. It's a conversation. It goes both ways. And so absolutely, research rigor needs to play a role in decision-making, and lived experience needs to play a role in decision-making. Importantly, it's also longitudinal and it's a relationship. So this is not an in and out sort of thing. You're developing trust. You're getting to know someone on a deep level over time. This informing decision-making is also really crucial here, is that as someone said, you need to set expectations early on about what the process of decision-making will be. Will it be truly democratic? Or will there ultimately be a person who says, I've taken this all into consideration and this is what we're doing? And then finally, this is involving stakeholders at every phase of research: prioritization, conceptualization, implementation, conduct, dissemination. You need them at every phase, often for different things. And then involving multiple stakeholder types, as Kim mentioned: patients, care partners, healthcare providers, advocacy groups, policymakers in research, helps to ensure that their research is feasible, that practices are saying that they will participate in your study without being paid. That is a great sign that you have designed to fit the context. This is something that is in demand and you're not pushing on them. That it is also scientifically rigorous and relevant to those that the research is intended to benefit. We've already presented in the past our dicemethods.org tool, and so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I will go over it again in a little bit, but we do have this education hub on the website where you can go read more about what stakeholder engagement is and find some more definitions and resources. There we go. So we have both an education hub and our engagement strategy finder tool, which I'll go through in a little bit. Okay. So as you think about stakeholders that you're engaging in your process, we think about this in a few different ways. Number one is you want to be thinking about the potential adopters of your dissemination product. Again, your intervention, your program, your method, your toolkit, whatever it is that you've developed. Who will actually use it? Who are those potential adopters? Sometimes you want to be thinking about engaging the influencers. They would not necessarily be the users of your product, but they might be making decisions about whether or not to even offer it, to pay for it, to advocate for it within their context. And on the other side, you have potential saboteurs, those who might really fight against your product being used in a particular context. And you need to know what motivates them, what they consider to be their value just as much as anyone else. Another thing to do is consider different levels of stakeholders. So you might adopt a socio-ecological model type of approach, where you're thinking about the individual level, interpersonal, community, organizational, or policy or enabling environment stakeholders as well. Often those policy or enabling environment or organizational leaders may actually be influencers that you really need to take into consideration, knowing if we need to convince them to even let this happen or to pay for it so that it removes a major barrier, what's going to convince them? I often use this 7P stakeholder framework, and these are the different types of stakeholders that you consider within the 7Ps framework. So patients in the public, they're all Ps, providers, healthcare clinicians, people who work within healthcare settings, policymakers, both big P and little p. So big P meaning like the government, and then little p meaning local policy, people making policies within hospital systems, for instance, people making policy within a local community organization, purchasers, people who are actually purchasing healthcare, and then on the other side, payers of healthcare, people paying the bill, product makers, as well as researchers, principal investigators. It's a P, so that's why I picked it. So any questions or comments about who do we think of as being stakeholders? Hopefully this is mostly a review. Yeah. Rebecca says that we call saboteurs frenemies. Sometimes they are the most important stakeholders because they challenge assumptions, absolutely. Challenge assumptions, and if you can convince those potential saboteurs, sometimes we call them the grumps, then they often become your biggest advocates. They can go and they will say, I was the biggest grump, I was the biggest challenger to this, and they really sold me, and here's why.
Bethany, do you want to say one point here too? Sometimes I've heard people say, gosh, the 7Ps seem so broad. Like, do I really have to think of all of them for every project? Do you have any comments for people who make that question?
Yes, so you should think about them in every project. Consider them. However, you may not need to actively engage them in every project. You may not have the time, you may not have the connections, you may not even know who they are in this particular case. But if you're thinking about your project as more than just, I have this one little thing I'm going to do and then move on. If you're thinking about the big picture, if you're thinking about the future and designing for dissemination and sustainability and scalability over the long term, you will eventually need to think about every level here. And so not today you don't, but eventually you will.
Thanks.
Okay, so what are some principles of stakeholder engagement? And I don't need to spend too much time here because Kim really covered a lot of these. There are a couple of different principle or frameworks of principles to consider. I like the Participatory principles that talks about reciprocal relationships, this notion of co-learning, where you're really not trying to turn patients into researchers, but they do need to know the basics of it. But you also, as a researcher, need to listen and learn from the expertise of those that you've invited in as stakeholders. Importantly, this is a true partnership, and this is often demonstrated through fair financial compensation, like we've discussed, as well as sharing decision-making. And then finally, transparency, honesty, and trust. These are very important principles, again, demonstrated through shared decision-making and just talking about here's the limitations of what we can and can't do. Here are the expectations of our funders. Here's what we've been told by the powers that be that we can and can't do. And so really being open about what those expectations and limitations are can help enhance that sense of trust. I also heard some reference earlier about different ways that we might make decisions and different levels of involvement of our stakeholders in the process of decision making. And so I like this IAP2 spectrum of public participation, where they lay out both the public participation goal and the promise to the public for different levels of impact on decisions within the context of your project. And so they lay out these 5 different categories, ranging from least impact on the decision to highest impact on the decision, starting with inform, where the
Sometimes your dog wants to participate in your presentation too. That's a different stakeholder level that we haven't had a chance to discuss previously. I do love this slide. That I'm glad if we had to stop someplace, I always think this one is so rich, and I often forget the group. So I'm making my note right now.
Sorry about that. My daughter just got home.
Yeah,
My dogs are very excited. Just making sure that the public stays informed about what you're doing, to consulting them on decisions and providing information, involving them over a longer term basis, potentially in making decisions, to all the way up through true collaboration, and ultimately fully empowering your community members and stakeholders to make decisions, that this becomes their final decision about what happens. I like to live in that sort of involve and collaborate level, but certainly there's opportunities to engage the public at every level. So what do you need to do? What skills do you need to have? What resources do you need to have available? And what mindsets do you need to adopt for stakeholder engagement? I cannot emphasize enough how important relationships are in this process. Building trust takes time. It requires open and honest communication. And so the very first thing, if you are not willing to go in and build a relationship, then really question your motivations for why you want to do stakeholder engagement. Another thing that's really hard for researchers is openness to change. If you walk in and say, I just want them to like sign off on what I'm doing here. I got this funding and this is the grant that I'm doing, and I just want the community members to pat me on the back and say, good job. Question your motivation and what you're doing there. We talk about this in the Designing for Dissemination course, is that we encourage a beginner's mindset. You might really understand what a process is like within your world, but that world may look really different for someone else. And so approach stakeholder engagement, approach design from a beginner's mindset, where you're really listening. Along those same lines, you approach this with respect for other people's perspectives, their historical and lived experience, and the expertise that they bring to the table. One of my favorite icebreakers that I like to have is going around the table and asking everyone to share their expertise. What are you an expert in? And you get all sorts of wonderful things. We get a lot of cooking and gardening related expertise. So we eat well as stakeholders when we get together. Another thing that's really important, more practically speaking, is to have community connections and partnerships. It's really hard to walk into a new community and say, stand on the street corner and say, I want to work with you, if you have no connections to that community, if you don't know anyone, if you don't have anyone to introduce you, if you don't even know where to start. How many of you, when you were doing your customer discovery interviews in our Designing for Dissemination course, sat down when we said, go schedule customer discovery interviews, and said, but I don't know anyone there? How many of you had that experience where you didn't even know where to start? Yeah, that's really hard. Another important skill is active listening. And I'm not going to go through this today, but if you want to know, there are particular techniques that you use for active listening. And going along with that is group facilitation. Marilyn Kors and I did a talk at CopperCon last year on group facilitation skills. I can send you that link if you'd like it. But it really walks through, really practically speaking, what are the steps for active listening and group facilitation. Another really important skill to have for stakeholder engagement is event planning and coordination. How do you get a bunch of people to get excited about coming together in a single place, virtual or in person, and having all of the things that are needed to make that be a really pleasant, productive experience? That takes skill. Another thing that I find really useful is the ability to do rapid synthesis of group insights. It comes with active listening, that you're listening for all of your stakeholder perspectives and you're putting them together, often really quickly. And you're repeating back what you're hearing from the group. And like, I'm really hearing that you're all saying this. Is that right? Am I hearing this correctly? It seems to be that there's a lot of energy behind this idea. Is this where you want to go? And so that ability is something I find goes along really well with qualitative research methods. And so if you have a qualitative research background, that sort of goes well as a nice sort of synergistic skill. And then finally, show up and care deeply and sincerely. Go where your community is, go where your stakeholders are when there's not a pandemic and they let you in the door. And truly demonstrate, sincerely demonstrate that you care about their experience and you want to listen and learn from them. Okay. So I thought maybe I would share just a little example here, and then would love to hear from some of you about your experience building stakeholder relationships as well. And so this is from a poster that our brain tumor stakeholder partnership group did. And these are some pictures from an event that we held in person in Sacramento a few years ago, where we got together our brand new stakeholder group, this Brain Cancer Quality of Life Collaborative. Most of these people had met on Twitter and only known each other on Twitter. And this was the first time that they had gotten together in person. And because Liz saw me, my partner, the person that I met at the conference a couple of weeks after my mother passed away, she is a Twitter advocate and very well-known person in the brain tumor space. It's why she was speaking at this conference. And she knows all these people. And so that's that community connection and partnership, where I didn't know anyone in this world. And I was actually approaching this more from a care partner perspective than I was from a researcher perspective. And so we had that shared experience. But her connections and in partnership enabled everyone to come together. And this was the start of building this relationship with people that we continue to text with and talk with on Twitter and email with and write grants with, and advance the research on stakeholder engagement and on palliative care for brain cancer. And so this initial meeting, getting together, getting to know each other, developing trust was really important. We also went and watched, I think it was February, and we went and watched some, it might have even been the Super Bowl together, and that was really fun. So anyone else have, any good examples of sort of initial stakeholder trust building and relationship building that you'd like to share? So there's like 15 of us, Danielle.
Yeah, I was just curious about the size of the how that impacts the interaction.
Yeah.
Large, it's challenging to get hear everyone's voices, I think.
Yeah, so the size of the group definitely plays a role. Come here, Pepper. And so sometimes if you're trying to get a bigger perspective from more people, that these stakeholder groups and these sorts of meetings won't work.
We've also had an issue in some of our groups of some of the stakeholders being very loud, taking up a little more space in the room than others, and trying to figure out ways to handle that.
Yes, Bethany comes back. Any comments on that, Bethany, with respect to any of the group facilitation methods of kind of dealing with dominant voices in the stakeholder groups?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And so I'm going through that right now with one of our stakeholder panels, where we have one particular person who likes to ask provocative questions at really inopportune times. And so I've really struggled with how to deal with that. And I mean, my immediate response was, they can't be on this panel. They can't keep doing that. It's been going on for months. I've had conversations already, you know, how do we just remove them from the panel altogether? And that's not been a popular opinion. And so we've thought about, well, what are other ways for making sure that we can get everyone's perspective? And so we often use like small group breakouts. When we have a group of 20 people, you can have 4 or 5 smaller group sessions as long as you have someone to facilitate each breakout. And so that's been a really effective way to make sure that we have other people able to contribute. And then another way that we do this is even when you don't have a person who has like a loud voice, you do often have introverts and their perspectives are really important. And so I like to offer multiple ways that people can provide input. It doesn't have to be in this group environment. And so we say, you can always email us. We are happy to have a one-on-one phone call. We do like asynchronous contributions. We do little surveys. We have Google Docs that people can contribute to. So really try to invite people to contribute in a wide variety of different ways that they're comfortable with.
And Bethany, do you want to let Betsy weigh in for just a second, maybe about her small group piece too? Or I don't want to disrupt the flow of your slides.
No, that's okay. Go ahead. Betsy, do you want to share what you have there?
Oh, sure. I was just eating Greek yogurt, so I hope I don't have any on my face while I'm talking. But yeah, I've had good luck also, Bethany. I'm glad you mentioned that with small groups, and I try and be really intentional around the topic. And every time I do them, I construct them in a different way based on their expertise. So like if we have a topic that's particularly relevant to clinicians, I might make sure they're dispersed throughout the small groups and mixed evenly. And I think they really enjoy getting to know the other members on the committee more individually. But I also really try to recognize the expertise that I think they're bringing and try and draw that out. Because you do wonder sometimes people are like, why am I here? What do they want from me? And so I try to be really clear about that.
That is a really great insight. Yes, that happens a lot of people not knowing, why am I here? What do you want from me? And so getting to know people and how they're comfortable being asked to contribute. And sometimes I really like the Zoom interaction sometimes, because I can send a private chat message to someone and say, I would really love for you to share your thoughts on this. Is that something you're comfortable doing? And they're like, oh, yes, I'm happy to. And so then they speak up. And so sometimes inviting people in is really effective. And if you've called on someone and you've asked them to speak about their experience, then that sort of tells others, be quiet for a minute. Okay, so then you have this group that you've put together, you're facilitating meetings, you're doing a lot of active listening, you're building trust and relationship, but how do you actually do the engagement? This is one of the biggest questions we get is, okay, but what am I doing? What's the method? I'm just talking with people. And so this DICE methods tool, our stakeholder engagement navigator tool, provides guidance on both picking a method for stakeholder engagement to guide your process, as well as implementing it. And so as we went about developing this tool, we came across a whole bunch of different methods and approaches and techniques you might use. And we spent a lot of time figuring out, well, what goes in our selection tool versus what is just something you need to know about if you're going to approach stakeholder engagement. And so one of the things that we did is we distinguished an approach from a method and a tool. And I'll define each of those for you. So approach is like an organizing framework that you use in a grant proposal that is used to establish with your stakeholders at the outset their role in decision-making, as well as their role in conceptualization, conduct, and dissemination of the research. So these are big picture things. They don't necessarily walk you step by step through what to do. They more give you sort of an overarching structure or process or set of principles. And so I believe you received each of these slides And so each of these is a link that you can follow, but this is also all in our dicemethods.org website. And I'm not going to go through each of these, but a couple different approaches are community-based participatory research, or CBPR. Similar, but also a little bit different, is community engaged research. There are deliberative processes. I really like DeVerke's conceptual model for stakeholder engagement. It sort of gives you like general ideas, big buckets of work to do as you engage your stakeholders. There's experience-based co-design frameworks, and then there's the PICORI D&I framework as well that also has elements of stakeholder engagement to consider. So in contrast to an approach, that sort of high-level framework, are specific methods. So a method is a set of tools, techniques, and processes that are used to enact all of the high-level purposes of engagement: identifying and convene your stakeholders, creating reciprocal relationships, creating that heterarchy that Kim mentioned, engaging in bidirectional communication, eliciting perspectives, and making decisions over time and in partnership with your stakeholders. And there are these pre-existing packages of methods. So bootcamp translation is a popular one we use here at the University of Colorado, citizen juries, community engagement studios. So these are sort of well-defined methods, and you can say this is the method we're using, or you can put together your own package of discrete tools and techniques that really match your own needs and resources depending on what you're trying to accomplish in your project. And so some examples of stakeholder engagement methods include appreciative inquiry, bootcamp translation, citizen juries, community engagement studios, concept mapping approaches, deliberative polling, Delphi techniques, human-centered design, the I-Core model, which is the customer discovery and value proposition design approach that we teach in D4D, online collaborative platforms, online communities, and stakeholder panels. So in our stakeholder engagement navigator tool, under the Find Engagement Strategies section, there is a really nice interactive portion where you can pick what type of stakeholder engagement method you're going to use, and we'll do a little demo of that. So before you use the tool, we want you to consider, what do you hope to achieve through stakeholder engagement? What's your purpose here? Are you early on in prioritization? Are you trying to figure out dissemination strategies? Are you trying to interpret data and figure out what you're going to message to the community? What budget do you have? Do you have any budget at all or not? That's totally fine. You can do something no matter what. Over what period of time do you expect to engage your stakeholders? How many interactions do you anticipate? Do you really only have time and budget for one, or do you want it to be multiple? And then how much time per interaction? So how much time do you expect from your stakeholders in any given interaction? So if you were going to approach a policymaker for stakeholder engagement, how much time and how many interactions do you expect that they would agree to give you? What do you think? Anyone have any ideas?
Bethany, will you restate the question, please?
Yeah, so if you were going to approach a policymaker and you said, well, I'm going to figure out what sort of engagement method I'm going to use to engage with a policymaker, maybe the government. How many interactions and how much time do you think they'll give you? Carol says 15 minutes.
Maybe you get 15 minutes with their staffer.
Maybe. Jason has high hopes for 30 minutes, right? What can you do in 15 to 30 minutes? Right? What are you going to do? And then finally, what sort of staffing and expertise are available to you? Are you going to do this all by yourself, or do you have other people that can help you? Okay, so here is just a screenshot here of the engagement method selection tool. Like I said, we'll go through a demo here, but essentially what you do is you've already chosen your stage of research, your purpose of engagement. There's a really nice checklist that you can pick, and then you indicate what's your budget, very little money, if any, moderate amount, lots and lots of money, How much time are you expecting per interaction and how many interactions? I'm glad you like it, Tina. We used design thinking and a lot of user-centered design to develop this. And one of the things that we really emphasized was a sense of joy in using the tool. And so what happens as you indicate these different selections is that the recommended methods get bigger and darker, and the ones that are less recommended for what you're trying to do or for your constraints get smaller. And then you can click on each of them and they bring up a page that describes more details about what it is, how to use it, what the step-by-step process is. I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to mention briefly that stakeholder engagement can use co-design methods. It can use design thinking types of approaches, user-centered design. That's what we use to develop this tool. The paper that you were all sent for today describes our process of developing the tool and the different components there. And so it's like design inception. But you can see we spent a lot of time working on this for several years before it really came to fruition. It was also really expensive. We estimate about $500,000. Finally, one of the things that this tool also recommends are tools to support stakeholder engagement. And we distinguish these because they do not necessarily meet the definition of stakeholder engagement by themselves. So a tool is a means for gathering information, informing decision-making, facilitating group discussion and brainstorming. And we say that they really should be used in tandem or to complement other methods of stakeholder engagement for very specific purposes. I often use these for facilitating or guiding a particular meeting. I really like this purpose to practice technique for an initial stakeholder meeting. It takes several hours to do, but it's a great way to get everyone on the same page, build that shared mental model of what are we doing and how are we going to get there together. So this paper right here, this is a commentary in the American Journal of Bioethics that our D2B group put together a few years ago. And one of the really important concepts here is that qualitative research methods are not engagement, but they can inform engagement. They can go together. Qualitative research methods like interviews and focus groups are not by themselves stakeholder engagement, but it can be used to inform a larger community engagement effort. And so when I review CCTSI pilot grants and people say they're using community and stakeholder engagement and they're doing key informant interviews and that's their engagement method, I say, interviews are great, but it's not engagement. How are you doing bidirectional longitudinal engagement? So that's something I really encourage you to think about is, how are you using interviews or focus groups in the context of a broader effort to engage your community? Okay, so I thought it would be fun to do an actual sort of quick example here. And I know we just have a few minutes.
Bethany, you're brave to do live demonstrations. We can all appreciate Bethany's bravery. Maybe you can do something for Heidi's no money, no time.
All right, sounds good. Heidi, you up for that?
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry. I feel like I've been cheating. I already started doing it. So multitasking a little bit.
No, that's awesome. So what research stage did you select? Planning, implementation, or dissemination?
I did planning and implementation.
Perfect. That's one of the things we found in our user testing is people wanted to pick more than one stage. Originally, you couldn't. Okay. And then within planning and implementing, why do you want to engage your stakeholders?
So I think the one that's the second from the bottom is the most relevant one.
Okay. So figure out how to implement. Great.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So you already said you have no money.
Yep.
How much time? Well, let's start with number of interactions. How many times do you think you can get your stakeholders together?
So with our stakeholders, since this is like mandated by VA central office. We're meeting with them like every other week. So it'll be more than 10 times. I know it's a lot. Which is why I think they hate us. Well, only some of them. Not all of them, just one of them is so grumpy.
Yeah, well, like I said, the grumps can be very useful.
I know, well, he freaking volunteered. I'm just like, dude, you volunteered to, like, you signed up. Like,
you just wanted an excuse to be grumpy. And how much time do you meet each time?
An hour or less.
Okay. So a lot of very short interactions. So it is suggesting here that conversation cafes, so this is conversation cafes, hosted conversations held in public settings like a cafe where anyone's welcome to join. It sounds like maybe that's not quite right for your context. Discovery and action dialogues, not dogs, are lightly facilitated brief conversations with a group, unit, or community, and then the stakeholder panel advisory committee type of methodology. And so you can click on these. And so here we go. Here's the full definition. This is for identifying positive deviant behaviors and practices. So these are solutions currently in use by high performers that can be adapted or replicated by others with similar resources or circumstances. So that's interesting. We can click on this and it takes us to, oh, so this is one of the liberating structures. This is a really nice group facilitation technique. And I can go through this and I can say, does this seem like it's going to fit? Here's some good examples I can follow. And then, oh, this conversation cafe, this also looked interesting. I can click on that for more information and it'll open up one of these other pages there. It's not working right now. I think my internet is tired. And then another one here, stakeholder panel and advisory committees, and it'll take you to more pages to learn more about it. So I'm going really fast because we're almost out of time here. But so what do you all think? Does this feel like something you might be able to use to help narrow down how you might approach stakeholder engagement?
Got a chat for sure. And you've had comments as we've gone along in the chat that people are saying this is a great tool. They're going to post it on various websites for organizations.
Please do share broadly. There's also this little video that's just me talking. We recently went to our CU Productions office and made a much nicer, better produced video and had one of our stakeholder partners come. And I both give an overview of stakeholder engagement and how to use this tool, and then have this really beautiful conversation about, well, what is it really? What is the essence of stakeholder engagement? And what does it mean to develop trust and relationship and partnership with community and your stakeholders? So that will be in a version coming up soon in the next few months. Awesome. Well, I'm so glad you like all of this, and hopefully this helps demystify how to do stakeholder engagement. You're always welcome to do customer discovery and value proposition design, of course.
All right, fantastic. I love how these presentations dovetailed nicely together. So many thanks to Kim and to Bethany for their great presentations today. We already mentioned, please hope to see you on Thursday for Monica Jules Perez presentation, and she'll be with us next Tuesday to discuss the article we're going to send around of hers as well, and another journal club next week. So great job, everyone. Thanks so much. Have a great week.